Today, what I want to talk about in terms of Shariati is the dialectical method, or the dialectics of history and the dialectics of religion, in more particular, that one can find within Shariati's work. For me, my first exposure to Shariati was when I was doing my master's degree, and I ended up writing a book about Ayatollah Khomeini. And part of the book on Khomeini was about Shariati's influence, not necessarily his direct influence on Khomeini, but his influence on society that Khomeini himself was able to utilize, that he was able to somehow appropriate into his own critique of the Shah and of the Shah's relationships with the United States. And one of the things that struck me is that Ali Shariati was a supreme dialectician. I mean, we talk about Hegel and Marx and the Marxist, the leftists that come after him, which of course Shariati in many ways studied, especially when he was in Paris. But he appropriated in many ways a dialectics from that type of philosophy. And my argument was not that he somehow borrowed it from the West and brought it into his own work, or brought it to the Muslim world and brought it to Iran, but he somehow made manifest that which was already latent within the Islamic tradition, especially within the Shi'i tradition. And what I tried to formulate in that work was the Hassan model of religious activism, or in many ways non-religious activism, and the Hussein model of religious activism, which I said that I argued Shariati followed. And it really was this difference between an active political engagement in the Hussein model and a quietist position in the Hassan model. So, or in the Hassan model. So, in the Hassan model, religion can be characterized by a few different principles. So, number one, that religion is somehow a stabilizing force. And this is the context from which Ali Shariati grows up, and where religion within Iranian society helped stabilize society. It helped perpetuate social statics. So it reproduced itself. It reproduced the tradition in such a way that it didn't change fundamentally the society, but rather kept the society close to what it was with each passing generation. And that is, in many ways, it's a routinization of Ali and Hussein in the authority that they have passed into the tradition. And that authority was basically reproduced to stabilize society. So social statics was one of the defining characteristics of the Hassan model. The Hassan model is also anticipatory in the sense that if change happens, it will happen eschatologically, right? Not small minor changes, but large changes. A radical transformation of society will happen eschatologically through the coming of the Mahdi, right? And so when you have a population that is waiting for that transformative moment to happen, they're waiting for it to happen by this particular eschatological individual, this messianic individual. And therefore what that does is it removes responsibility for radical social change from the population, from the body of believers, and to an individual. Marx's critique of religion as the opiate of the masses is also very much a fundamental characteristics of the Hassan model, in the sense that it reconciles the believers to the overall conditions of the given society. In reconciliation with them, it provides some kind of comfort. It provides some sort of way of living with the conditions as they are, even if they're horrible, even if it causes much suffering. People can take some kind of consolation in the religious tradition in and of itself. So society, the way it is in this type of perspective, is divinely ordained as such, right? And therefore the faithful have no charge to transform society, right? In any type of real structural way. Another defining aspect of the Hassan model is that it's dogmatic, right? That dogmatism becomes a fundamental pillar. So you can think that while the Shi'i tradition allows for internal discourse, debate, the overall tradition holds authority and allows for very little transformative change or even reinterpretation of it. Even Khomeini, as I wrote in my book, waited for his predecessor's death before he would enter into the political realm. I mean, he had positions on the Shah. He had positions on what was going on in Iranian society with Khabzadegi and everything else, but he never really made it public until his predecessor's death, because his predecessor was a devoted quietist that wanted him to remain quiet in an advisory role as opposed to active in the public sphere. And so it was a reproduction of these dogmas that Khomeini was doing, and of course Shariati would challenge that. The problem, of course, that I think Shariati saw with just the reproduction of these dogmas is that dogmatism allows for the continuity of tradition, yes, but it ties believers to those dogmas without allowing them to activate them or translate them or reinterpret them in such a way that they can address very modern problems. And therefore, the tradition in its static form can become dysgenic. It itself can be a cause of a lot of social problems because it can't transform, because it can't meet the challenges of the day. And because it fails to address those conditions, it somehow becomes a handmaiden of, let's say, a tyrannical state, as we had with the Shah. The last of these characteristics is the Hassanic religion, as I call it. In a Hassanic religion, in this way, offers an interpretation of reality, but it offers only a quietist orientation of action. So if we take a very broad definition of what religion is, you could say it's an interpretation of reality and an orientation of action. Sometimes it's connected with a divine being, sometimes it's connected to multiple divine beings. We don't need to go into the definitions of religion. We know what kind of a quagmire that is. But the Hassanic religion is a quietist religion, right? It's a religion of reproduction of the status quo, wherein the internal discourses of the religion remain ghettoized, if you will. The real discourses are in the debates between scholars. They don't breed or let's say bleed out into the to the main population. What the population has to do is simply accept the basic dogmas and reproduce them and be good and faithful to them. And so religion isn't a force for massive or radical or transformative change under a Hassanic model. Now, the Hussein model, as opposed to the Hassanic model, is very different. This is the model that Shariati really brings to the fore in Iran. And that is religion as a dynamic force, right? It rejects the stabilization or religion simply as a pattern maintenance subsystem, right? It rejects stabilization because stabilization somehow perpetuates injustice, right? I mean, people always talk about we have to have peace, but when you have peace within the conditions of an unjust society, you're simply stabilizing injustice, right? And the Hussein model completely rejects that reproduction of the unjust status quo. The Hussein model is not only based on routinized authority, but it's also charismatic authority, to go back to the Weber tradition. And that is that individual has some sort of routinized authority, right? It might not be the case so much in Shariati, but it would be the case with Khomeini. But also he has charismatic authority, and that is he has, or is perceived to have, special gifts, right? And maybe in Shariati, the case of special gifts is that he could formulate, right, a revolutionary Islamic perspective more so than anyone else possibly could. And he could translate it to the population, to the people, in such a way that they could understand it, right? I mean, we have to remember that so many of his quote unquote books are actually speeches, right? Because he was in many ways a teacher beyond he was a theorist sitting down and developing theories, but he was a teacher. And those theories came out of that discourse that he constantly had with his students and with his audience. And there was a perspective that here is this scholar, unlike any and all scholars, that is deeply entrenched in the Shia tradition, yet he's somehow making manifest all these latent elements that are there. He's not borrowing them from the West, right? They're there already, but he's bringing them up to the fore, right? More so than anyone else did at that time. So he has that kind of charismatic authority. And that charismatic authority, interesting enough, in many ways is based in taqlid, right? In emulation. But emulation of who? Not a blind emulation of, let's say, the clerics or whatnot, but an emulation of Muhammad, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, Ali alayhi salam, and Hussein alayhi salam, right? These people, that's who he's emulating, right? And that's who he's drawing the people back to, right? To look at, this is how they dealt with their situation of tyranny at their time, right? They didn't do it through quietism. They didn't do it just simply through making salah faithfully 5 times a day or whatever, right? They were active. And you see that with Shariati, that he's active. So he's engaged in this taqlid of the primordial sources, right? The very beginning sources of the Islamic and Shi'i tradition. So it's, in that case, it's social dynamics over social statics, right? It's not anticipatory like the Hassan model, right? The conditions of the world and conditions in Shariati's time of the Iranian state, the responsibility to change those conditions were left with the people, right? Very democratic in that sense, as opposed to messianic. You know, it's more like we have to construct a society that the Mahdi could endorse, as opposed to we have to wait for the Mahdi to come and create that society. But we create the society that the Mahdi can endorse, right? To somehow maybe prepare it, right? And so it's not anticipatory at all, but responsibility for the transformative structural change lies with the people. Of course, that we all know what that meant during the revolutionary period. That meant that a lot of people would bear the ultimate price for taking on the responsibility of transforming society, and that is they would be martyred, right? But of course, even martyrdom can be revolutionary, and oftentimes it is. So his form of the Shi'i tradition is against what Marx assumed about religion, which of course Marx was just simply following Feuerbach. But the Shi'i tradition, especially the way Shariati translated it or interpreted it, was not opiate, but forgive me, it was Viagra. You know what I mean? It wasn't dulling the senses. It was, alerting the senses. It was what Kant calls in his book, Religion Within the Bounds of Mere Reason. It sharpens the contradictions and sharpens the consciousness. It doesn't dull the consciousness. It actually makes people more aware of the contradictions within society, more aware of the oppression that's in society. It allows them the ability to articulate and to understand what the very structure of society is that creates these problems for them, that creates their suffering, so they can see that the horror and terror that they're dealing with is actually not necessary. It's not part of, or not necessarily part of the human condition, but something that's being manufactured by the way we organize society, right? And so, his reinterpretation or thinking about the Shi'i tradition makes people much more aware of the class conflict that was going on within the Iranian society. And as well as, the exportation of Western culture into Iran, the blind following of it, that, within the concept of Gharb Zadegi, on and on, what type of political role that had in somehow captivating the mind and preparing people for domination from the outside, right? I mean, in the neo-imperialist domination, in the sense that you didn't have American soldiers occupying Iran, but American force was very much a part of what Iran was, in, let's say, in the 1970s. I mean, we have to remember that over 50% of all American military exports in the 1970s went to Iran, right? I mean, when I tell my American students, they're like, why would we do that? They want to kill us all. I mean, you would be surprised how many times I hear that. And like, well, in the 1970s, slightly different, different perspective, you know. And so Shariati, by him calling out these things very openly, very publicly, that allowed people first in the Mashad and the universities to listen to him, understand, get a better understanding of what's going on behind the scenes. And then, of course, that becomes much more popular language, popular discourse, those arguments when it gets taken up by Ayatollah Khomeini. And we have to remember also that Khomeini was asked numerous times by other clerics to condemn Shariati, and he refused. He refused. It didn't mean he agreed with everything Shariati was saying and writing, but he refused to condemn them because, at least according to Bakr Moin's biography, Khomeini said, I can't call them un-Islamic, his ideas. Right? And a lot of these ideas were coming, like I said, were influenced at least from Western philosophical tradition. And he said they're not un-Islamic. So he found a way to bridge the ideas between Western philosophical thought and the Shia tradition in such a way that even the very conservative Ayatollah Khomeini couldn't say that they were un-Islamic, right? Now, the last part is that last characteristic of the Hussein model is that it reorients dogmas in that sense that the overall beliefs of the Shi'i tradition remains, but they're reoriented. They're translated differently, right? The latent radicality, as I talked about earlier, of the Shi'i tradition is made manifest, and it goes through a process of tajdeed, of renewal, right? Renovatio in Latin. It gets renovated. It's the same house, but it's different now fundamentally somehow, right? So the truth content of the dogma is preserved in Shariati's tradition, but the form, if you will, even the false form, the quietist form, is somehow negated when he's able to make this bridge, when he translates and reorients the Shi'i tradition. Now, talking about Shariati today briefly, and this is the last thing I'll say, it's interesting when I teach Shariati in my Islamic tradition courses, students tend to have the idea that he is a fundamentalist, or he's an extremist. And it's certainly not the case by any stretch of the imagination. He's not, you know, I would say astaghfirullah if I had to say he's like bin Laden or something like that, you know, the supreme intellect versus the guy just who has a lot of money and puts it towards his position, right? But he does not fundamentally reject otherness, right? He's not xenophobic at all. He's open to learning from all perspectives, from all peoples, which is a problem that, you know, in the Muslim world, where people would say, well, this is not Islamic, then we can't have it. You know what I mean? We should reject it. We have it in the Western world too. You know, what can we learn from these Muslims? You know what I mean? They don't teach us anything, you know. That same perspective is not the perspective of Shariati. He doesn't insist on a homogeneity of thought and praxis, right? He's not retrotopian in any kind of way where he thinks that the answers to the problems of the Ummah today are all in the past. Right, I hear from a lot of my friends who are more Wahhabi oriented who will say Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Taymiyyah. Everything is Ibn Taymiyyah. We have to go to the past, right? And that's not Shariat. He's ready to learn from the past, but it's a future-oriented remembrance, right, with the practical intent to bring about structural transformation to alleviate unnecessary suffering and horror and terror, right? And so he doesn't insist on a homogeneity of thought and praxis. He does not demand blind obedience to authority, clearly, right? He did not advocate violence against innocents to forward political goals, right? Certainly he advocated for revolution, but revolution was very much surgical. There was an enemy. It was the Shah. It was Savak, right? It was the ruling elites who were perpetuating this type of abuse of the masses. So it wasn't this blind, you know, attack on people. It was what he advocated for was a socially conscious form of religion, not religion as some kind of healing balm for all of our little existential problems, but one that was infused with social consciousness, that look for structural change to the damage being done to the ummah, as opposed to just simply individualistically falling back into religion as a way to soothe our souls, right? So it had a social function, a social benefit. We'll say this relativity is especially important, right? Meaning that it's relative to the society he believed in, that religion or a socially conscious form of religion is relative to the society he lived in. Because if we ask ourselves, you know, I as a Westerner steeped within the Islamic tradition, living in the heart of the empire that's in decline, right? That's my current condition. You know, what relevance is Shariati to us, right? And for me, my perspective is that Shariati was precisely what he was within the Iranian context. His religiosity was beneficial to the Iranian context. His religiosity wouldn't be beneficial to the Western context, right? Especially not in the US that pretends to be religious, but really has a lot of disdain for religion from its very beginning, right? But it pretends to be religious. That doesn't mean, though, we couldn't learn from Shariati at all, right? The question is, how can we translate Shariati's social consciousness form of thinking, right? His political engagement, his economic engagement that comes through a religious language. How can we translate that into a secular language that could be beneficial for the West? And for me, that's one of the things that my project, my working and my thinking about Shariati brings me to, is not to simply utilize him, but Americans, by and large, don't know who Shariati is. That's, you know, even American scholars. I mean, I could poll my whole philosophy department that I got my Ph.D. in, who's Ali Shariati, and none of them would know, I can guarantee you, right? Yet I think he could be a very influential person in the West if his work can be translated into publicly accessible language, secular language that could be appropriate and non-alienating to Western scholars, of course. How that gets to the American people, this type of stuff, good luck, right? I mean, that is the difficult thing to do. We won't even listen to our own philosophers, let alone a philosopher with some kind of unpronounceable name from Iran, right? But nevertheless, that's where I'm going to try to, you know, that's where my work is right now. What Shariati could mean to the West. Could he make a contribution, his thinking, make a contribution to Western society? Could it somehow bring a different kind of perspective to the way Islam is practiced here? Because the Islam is practiced in the United States really not in a very public way. The only people that are very public about their faith in the Islamic tradition in the United States are Muslim women. That's because they're visible with their hijabs, right? But Muslim men generally do not make any public statements or don't show their religiosity very often, right? I think that's something Shariati would reject. I think Shariati understood that the Muslim was supposed to be different, not just look different, but be fundamentally different in a good way. And that is something that I think is worth continual discourse and investigation with. So with that, I'll stop talking and I'll hand it back over to my dear brother Ismail.